Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take these complex, really multifaceted public careers, stack up all the source material, and then distill it into the essential knowledge you need to be informed fast.
And our mission today is arguably one of our most demanding.
I think so. We're synthesizing the immense, decades-long public career of Hillary Rodham Clinton.
This is a figure whose influence spans 5 decades of American public life. I mean, you're talking right from the late 1960s all the way through to her current academic roles in 2025.
Yeah.
You are looking at someone who has occupied roles from First Lady to U.S. Senator, Secretary of State, and I think most critically became the first woman nominated for U.S. president by a major party.
It's a truly staggering range of experience. I mean, it covers political, legal, diplomatic high points.
Good.
And our source material for this is a comprehensive biographical compilation. We're talking a full history, from her birth in 1947 right through to today.
The sheer scope just demands a structured, chronological approach, but we have to keep a sharp focus on synthesis.
Right.
Exactly. Her professional life isn't just, a list of roles. It's a reflection of these immense shifts in American politics, in cultural norms, and of course, the evolving role of women in power.
So our goal is to track that full, complex arc of her influence.
That's it. To understand how the young, idealistic student navigated just relentless controversy, how she adapted her political identity and operated constantly at the highest levels of power, all while setting new precedents.
There's a central thread we should probably look for, isn't there?
I think the central thread we'll be looking for is the tension between her progressive heart and her political pragmatism.
I really like that framing, the tension between the idealist and the pragmatist. Okay, let's unpack this and jump right in, starting at the beginning, her formative years, and that crucial political evolution that really set her on this path.
So Hillary Diane Rodham was born in Chicago in 1947, but she was raised in Park Ridge, Illinois.
And this is a traditional, politically conservative.
Very traditional. A Methodist family. And this early environment is absolutely essential because it sets up that philosophical tension we just talked about.
Her early political alignment was surprisingly conservative, wasn't it? When we look back now, it just seems almost incompatible with the rest of her career.
It was profoundly conservative. We have this fascinating early anecdote here that just perfectly illustrates her early alignment with the Republican Party, even before she hit high school.
Okay.
As a 13-year-old, after the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon, she actively canvassed Chicago's South Side. And why?
Right. Why would she do that?
She genuinely believed she had found evidence of electoral fraud that worked against the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon.
So a preteen actively pursuing election integrity for the GOP, that's some serious dedication.
It is. And she was dedicated enough to later campaign for Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election.
Yeah.
But at the same time, her political development was being shaped by these two competing influences. It was almost a tug of war.
Okay, so who are the two sides in this tug of war?
On one side, you had her father, Hugh Rodham, who was a fervent anti-communist, a traditionalist Republican, just rock-ribbed.
And on the other?
On the other side, her Methodist minister, a man named Donald Jones, who focused heavily on issues of social justice and civil rights. He took her and the youth group to see Martin Luther King Jr. speak in Chicago.
That sounds like an intellectual pressure cooker. You've got traditionalism battling social awareness right at the dinner table and in church. It seems like the perfect breeding ground for that eventual centrist self-identity.
It is.
So where does this tension start to visibly resolve itself, or at least come to a head?
It really culminates during her time at Wellesley College, starting in 1965, where she chose to major in political science. She arrived there as a dedicated Republican and, pretty quickly became president of the Wellesley Young Republicans.
But this wasn't the extreme right wing, though.
No. They were what she later called Rockefeller Republican-oriented.
For listeners who might not recall that era, what did Rockefeller Republican really signify politically?
That term is so crucial. It represents the liberal or moderate wing of the GOP during the mid-20th century. These were figures like New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller or Senator Edward Brooke. They were, generally fiscally conservative, but they supported civil rights, environmental protection, and a more engaged role for government in social issues.
So this shows she was already leaning toward a form of intellectual conservatism, but paired with this real desire for social progress.
Exactly. But the mid-60s were just a period of cataclysmic change. The Vietnam War was escalating. The civil rights movement was gaining serious legislative traction.
You can't be in college at that time and not be affected by it.
Absolutely not. She credits that intense atmosphere surrounding the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War with rapidly changing her views while she was in college. She famously described herself in a letter to her youth minister as having a mind conservative and a heart liberal.
And that dichotomy, that desire for stability and order, but combined with the desire for social justice, that really would define her entire career, wouldn't it?
It's the origin point. It's the origin of her lifelong desire to seek change within the system through established political means rather than through, radical confrontation from the outside.
So what finally caused the definitive break? What was the moment she left the Republican Party for good?
The 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. She had been invited to assist Nelson Rockefeller's late entry campaign for the presidential nomination.
Okay.
But she was profoundly upset by Richard Nixon's campaign tactics, which she perceived as subtly exploiting racial anxieties, and by what she saw as the convention's abandonment of the progressive reformist wing of the party.
So Nixon gets the nomination.
The party nominated Nixon, who, in her view, had moved too far to the right, and she left the Republican Party for good immediately after that convention.
And that decision, that break, it led directly to her big aha moment on the national stage, her 1969 Wellesley commencement speech. And that was not a standard student address.
Not at all. It was an unprecedented moment. She was elected by her classmates to be the first student in Wellesley history to speak at the commencement ceremony. Her address was scheduled immediately following the main speaker, Senator Edward Brooke, the Republican from Massachusetts she had once admired.
So what was the substance of her speech? What did she say that was so provocative?
She used her time to critique Brooke's remarks directly. She argued that his optimism about the pace of political change was, well, insufficient and maybe even complacent, particularly regarding civil rights and the war. She spoke about the need for immediate, meaningful social change, stating, "The challenge now is to practice politics as the art of making what appears to be impossible possible."
Just imagine that scene. A 21-year-old student challenging a sitting U.S. senator at her own graduation. What was the reaction in the room?
The reaction was electric. She received a spontaneous standing ovation from the crowd and her classmates that lasted a full 7 minutes.
7 minutes.
A full 7 minutes. It was so impactful that she was featured in Life magazine because of the public response to her criticism. She was suddenly, thrust onto the national map as a serious, formidable, young public figure, highly articulate and politically sharp. That speech essentially announced her presence in public life.
And from that high-profile moment at Wellesley, she moved right into Yale Law School, which seems like a natural next step, maintaining that focus on social justice and advocacy.
Yes. At Yale, she joined the editorial board of the Yale Review of Law and Social Action. She focused heavily on legal advocacy for marginalized groups, specifically working on child abuse cases at Yale New Haven Hospital and helping to found New Haven Legal Services. This wasn't abstract legal theory. This was hands-on work with direct social impact.
So this is where she's laying the academic foundation for her later policy work as First Lady, specifically around children's health and safety.
Precisely. Her seminal 1973 scholarly article, Children Under the Law, is still frequently cited in the legal field.
What's so fascinating about that piece? What was the core argument?
She was arguing against the prevailing legal notion that children should be presumed legally incompetent until they reach the age of majority. Instead, she argued that courts should presume competence on a case-by-case basis, treating child citizens as powerless individuals whose legal rights deserved independent consideration.
That sounds radical for the time.
It was. Arguing for a child's right to representation and to participate in decisions affecting their own welfare.
And of course, while she was building this incredibly impressive legal and policy resume at Yale, she met Bill Clinton. And after all that preparation for this bright future in the political centers of the Northeast, she chooses a radically different path. She moves to Arkansas.
She did. She initially failed the D.C. bar exam, though she immediately passed the Arkansas exam, and she initially declined Bill Clinton's proposals to marry him. But she eventually chose to marry him in 1975 and moved to Arkansas. It was viewed by many of her contemporaries as a surprising career setback for someone with such immense political potential. Her own words later were very telling. She said she chose to follow her heart instead of her head. It was a choice that immediately shifted her career from the established policy track in D.C. to the far more intimate and politically charged environment of a southern state.
That move to Arkansas in the mid-70s marks the start of this fascinating period where she's cementing her professional independence, but at the same time, she's becoming a political spouse in a very traditional Southern state. Let's look at the incredible professional path she forged in Little Rock.
She joined the Rose Law Firm in February 1977, and this wasn't just any firm.
Right.
It was a political and economic powerhouse in Arkansas, deeply, deeply connected to the state's elite. And she specialized in complex commercial law, things like patent infringement and intellectual property, rather than, standard political law.
By 1979, she becomes the firm's first woman partner.
First woman partner.
Becoming the first woman partner in a major Southern law firm in 1979 is just an enormous achievement in its own right. What does that accomplishment tell us about the power structure in Arkansas at the time?
I think it tells us two things. First, her legal pedigree from Yale gave her this unique standing and cachet. She wasn't just another local lawyer.
Sure.
Second, she was clearly a successful and valuable lawyer. She was a rainmaker for the firm, using her prestige and growing connections to bring in clients. And here is a very telling detail about her independent standing. From 1978 until she entered the White House in 1993, she consistently earned a higher salary than her husband.
So she had independent financial power.
She did, and she never abandoned her advocacy work, even as she was climbing that corporate legal ladder.
Right, she kept that part of her identity alive.
Absolutely not. Her commitment to children's issues remained primary. In 1977, she co-founded Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. Then, when Bill Clinton became governor in 1979, he appointed her chair of the Rural Health Advisory Committee.
And what did she do there?
She secured vital federal funds to expand medical facilities, particularly in the state's poorest, most underserved rural areas. Furthermore, she served on the board of the Legal Services Corporation, appointed by President Carter, and was the first female chair from mid-1978 to mid-1980. This allowed her to continue influencing national policy on legal aid for the poor.
But operating within the highest echelons of power and finance in a state capital, that inevitably introduces the scrutiny that would just follow her for the rest of her public life. The late 1970s brought the first waves of serious financial and political controversies.
Yes, 1978 and 1979 were pivotal. Two major financial actions during this period would later fuel years and years of investigation. First, the infamous cattle futures controversy.
Okay, break this down for us.
She made an initial $1,000 investment in cattle futures contracts. Over 10 months, that investment yielded nearly $100,000.
Okay, I have to stop you there. A $1,000 investment yielding a 10,000% return in 10 months.
Even if it was totally clean, that just sounds like a political liability written in neon lights.
It does. How did she and the family defend that transaction at the time?
Well, the defense was that the trades were legitimate, that they were guided by advice from a close friend and Tyson Foods attorney, a man named James Blair, who had high-level access to the commodities market.
But the media.
The media scrutiny alleged it was less about luck and more about a potential conflict of interest or even, a veiled bribe, using the anonymity of the commodities market to compensate her or her husband.
But were there any charges?
Crucially, though the story was highly scrutinized for years, no formal investigation was ever made, and she was never charged with any wrongdoing. The perception, however, was cemented.
And the second controversy was Whitewater, which became far more famous.
That's right. This was an ill-fated investment in the Whitewater Development Corporation, a real estate venture the Clintons entered into with Jim and Susan McDougal. The investment was made in the 70s, but the enterprise failed, incurring significant losses. It would eventually balloon into a massive federal investigation lasting through the mid-1990s, dominating news cycles and leading to years of document searches and testimony.
So it's clear that even before the national stage, she was operating in this politically charged environment where financial dealings with state power players were immediately and intensely scrutinized. And this political pressure even extended to her name.
This is such a powerful illustration of that conflict between her professional identity and her role as a political spouse. After Bill Clinton lost his re-election bid for governor in 1980, advisors strongly suggested that Hillary Rodham's continued use of her maiden name was one reason for the loss, as it was perceived as, radical or anti-traditional by Arkansas voters.
So, the woman who had established herself as an independent, high-earning law partner compromise her professional identity for political expediency.
That is precisely what happened. To appease those traditionalist voters, she began publicly using Hillary Clinton, or sometimes Mrs. Bill Clinton.
Wow.
She later settled on Hillary Rodham Clinton when Bill started his second stint as governor in 1983. And she later acknowledged learning the hard way that some voters in Arkansas were seriously offended by her retaining her maiden name. It was a major concession to political reality.
So during that second stint as First Lady of Arkansas from '83 to '92, she took on a major policy fight, public education reform.
This was arguably her most significant achievement in Arkansas public life, and it really showcases that capacity for incremental structural change. As chair of the Arkansas Education Standards Committee, she led a prolonged and successful battle to reform the public education system.
And what was the hardest part of that fight?
The most difficult aspect was fighting the powerful Arkansas Education Association, the state teachers union, to establish mandatory teacher testing and set statewide standards for curriculum and classroom size. This was incredibly controversial, but ultimately seen as a major success in improving the state's educational outcomes.
And she was also simultaneously building a corporate governance resume, sitting on several boards, which, in retrospect, creates another layer of political tension.
Right. She served on the corporate boards of TCBY from 1985 to 1992, and most notably Walmart stores from 1986 to 1992.
And she was the first woman appointed to Walmart's board, wasn't she?
First woman, which came after significant public pressure on the founder, Sam Walton.
What's so fascinating here is that dual action, serving powerful corporate interests while trying to maintain her progressive instincts. It's a classic display of that pragmatism versus idealism tension.
This is a critical insight. Our sources confirm that as a board member, she successfully pushed Walmart to adopt more environmentally friendly practices, which aligns with her progressive side. But she was largely unsuccessful in advocating for more women in company management. And crucially, she remained silent on Walmart's notoriously aggressive anti-labor union policies.
And that silence on labor practices is a really powerful detail, one that had long-term consequences.
It absolutely does. That strategic silence, the prioritization of her role on the board, and perhaps those environmental wins over a very difficult fight on labor, was later cited as contributing to her loss of credibility with organized labor during her 2016 presidential run.
So it comes full circle.
Completely. It shows the tension between the progressive ideals she cultivated at Wellesley and Yale and the harsh compromises required to operate within the highest circles of power in a place like Arkansas. She chose the path of influence over the path of confrontation, and that's a choice she would make repeatedly.
When she arrived in the White House in 1993, the role of First Lady was just fundamentally redefined. I mean, she was the first FLOTUS with a postgraduate degree, her own established professional career. She hit the ground running, determined to be an active policymaker.
She took on an unprecedented and highly visible role right from the start. She had an office in the West Wing, in addition to the traditional East Wing offices.
Which was a huge signal.
A huge signal that her influence went far beyond social duties. Many historians regard her as the most openly empowered presidential wife since Eleanor Roosevelt, directly engaging in legislative and executive decisions.
And that prominence immediately drew heavy criticism. The idea of a First Lady playing a central policy-driving role was seen by some as an inappropriate usurpation of power.
That's right. Critics claim she had no mandate. They argued that voters had elected Bill, not Hillary, and that her role was inappropriate. Supporters, on the other hand, countered that voters knew she would be highly active, and her involvement was no different from any other trusted White House advisor.
And she immediately leaned into the biggest domestic challenge of the era: comprehensive health care reform.
She did.
Okay, let's unpack Hillary Care. The ambition was enormous.
It was immense. President Clinton named her chair of the task force on national health care reform in January 1993. The aim was comprehensive, universal health coverage, and the mechanism was primarily requiring employers to provide coverage through managed competition health maintenance organizations, or HMOs.
The complexity was just staggering, wasn't it?
Staggering. It involved 500 task force members working in extreme secrecy.
And that secrecy, coupled with the complexity, that seems to be what doomed it politically.
Precisely. The complexity meant it was difficult for the public and even for Congress to understand, and the secrecy just bred mistrust. It fueled the opposition's successful framing of the proposal as government overreach.
You had the Harry and Louise ads.
The Harry and Louise ads were devastatingly effective. So despite Democrats controlling both the House and the Senate, the proposal failed to even gain a floor vote and was officially abandoned by September 1994.
The political fallout was immediate and just severe.
The failure was devastating. I mean, many analysts cite it as a major factor in the Democrats' crushing defeat in the 1994 midterm elections, the Republican Revolution, because it alienated crucial independent voters.
And what about her own approval rating?
Her own approval rating, which was in the high 50s when she started, plunged to a mere 35% by late 1994. It was a massive lesson in the limits of a First Lady's policy power and the hazards of overly complex, closed-door negotiations.
So she had to strategically retreat from that high-profile, complex policy role, but she didn't abandon policy entirely. What were her later, more successful legislative achievements during the rest of the 90s?
After that failure, the White House downplayed her primary policy role, and she pivoted. She pivoted to targeted legislative victories focusing on children. She played a leading role in the creation of the State Children's Health Insurance Program, or SCIP, in 1997.
For our listeners, what was SCIP's function? Why was it so important?
SCIP was essential. It provided low-cost health coverage to children and families who earned too much money to qualify for Medicaid but couldn't afford private insurance. It covered millions of uninsured children.
And that wasn't all.
No. She was also instrumental in the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, which expedited the placement of foster children and which she considered her greatest accomplishment as FLOTUS. And then the Foster Care Independence Act in 1999. These were structural, incremental changes that directly benefited children and families.
Beyond domestic policy, she carved out this significant role in international diplomacy and women's rights, breaking a travel record in the process.
She traveled to 79 countries as First Lady, successfully breaking Pat Nixon's previous record. But the enduring moment of her time as FLOTUS came in Beijing, China in September 1995.
The famous speech.
Yes. Speaking before the Fourth World Conference on Women, she forcefully argued against the systemic abuse and oppression of women globally and really shifted the definition of human rights.
And she delivered the line that became her rallying cry.
Women's rights are human rights, and women's rights are human rights, once and for all.
And she delivered that line, despite known internal White House concerns about upsetting China, and despite Chinese pressure to soften her remarks. That shows a really strong diplomatic and personal stand.
Absolutely. It was a moment of immense empowerment that resonated globally and remains one of the most cited phrases of her career. And following this, she helped create Vital Voices, an international initiative dedicated to encouraging women's political and economic participation worldwide.
Now we have to address the relentless, constant, the torrent of scandals and investigations that define the entire Clinton era in the White House.
This period was just a constant whirlwind of scrutiny, often driven by a conservative political opposition that was determined to uncover misconduct. The biggest investigation, Whitewater, arising from those 1970s real estate investments, led to her becoming the first spouse of a sitting U.S. president to be subpoenaed to testify before a federal grand jury in 1996.
What was the eventual factual finding of that investigation?
The final independent counsel report in 2000 found insufficient evidence of criminal wrongdoing by either Bill or Hillary Clinton in the Whitewater matter.
And it wasn't just Whitewater.
No. Similarly, investigations into Travelgate, which was the improper firing of White House travel staff, and Philgate, which was about improper White House access to hundreds of FBI background reports on former Republican staff, also concluded without finding substantial or credible evidence of misconduct by her.
Despite the outcomes, the sheer volume of investigations surely damaged her early public reputation.
Oh, they certainly did. These relentless investigations, combined with the Hillary Care failure, contributed significantly to her low approval ratings in the mid-90s. It really fostered the narrative that she was secretive and perhaps too focused on policy power.
But then comes the most intimate and intensely scrutinized controversy. The Lewinsky scandal in 1998, which led to Bill Clinton's impeachment. Her public response became almost as famous as the affair itself.
Right. When the allegations were first made public, she characterized them in an interview as a coordinated effort, coining the phrase, vast right-wing conspiracy.
A quote that immediately entered the political lexicon.
Absolutely. And it defined the aggressive defense of the administration. She later admitted she had been misled by her husband's initial denials.
This created a public relations paradox. Some saw a ruthless politician, others saw a dignified, powerful woman standing up to external pressure. What was the impact on her public image?
Public response was highly varied, but here's where it gets really interesting. In the immediate wake of the revelations and her public reaffirmation of her commitment to her marriage, her public approval ratings actually soared to around 70%.
So they went up?
They soared. And this wasn't necessarily a reward for staying in the marriage, but arguably a reward for her tactical display of strength and resilience in the face of what was widely perceived as political persecution by the opposition. Voters were rewarding her poise and her ability to maintain focus under just intense, hostile scrutiny.
Finishing up her FLOTUS tenure, she also left a mark in literature and preservation.
She did. Her bestseller, It Takes a Village, and Other Lessons Children Teach Us, published in 1996, was extremely successful. It even won her a Grammy Award for Best Spoken Word Album in 1997.
Right.
And she also founded Save America's Treasures, a nationwide initiative that successfully matched federal funds with private donations to preserve historic American sites and artifacts, ensuring a lasting cultural legacy.
The transition from First Lady to elected official was another historic first that really illustrates that tension between the political spouse and the individual leader. In 2000, she ran for and won a U.S. Senate seat representing New York,
becoming the first wife of a U.S. president to win elected office and the first female senator from New York.
and she actually served simultaneously in both roles for a brief period.
For exactly 17 days, from January 3rd to the 20th, 2001, she held both the title of First Lady and U.S. Senator. That is a truly unique historical footnote, symbolizing the bridge between those two distinct phases of her career.
Her tenure as senator was defined immediately by the September 11th attacks, just 9 months into her term. And her response was heavily focused on New York's recovery, often requiring her to work across the aisle.
Correct. She became deeply involved in securing aid for the state. Working closely with her fellow New York Senator Chuck Schumer, she was instrumental in securing $21 billion in funding for the World Trade Center site redevelopment.
And for the first responders.
Yes, she also took a prominent role in investigating the health issues faced by 9/11 first responders, becoming a real advocate for their long-term care. Politically, she voted in favor of the USA Patriot Act in October 2001.
But the defining vote of her Senate career, the one that would haunt her future presidential ambitions for over a decade, was the Iraq War resolution.
This is a critical point of analysis regarding her political pragmatism. She voted in favor of the October 2002 resolution authorizing President Bush to use military force against Iraq. At the time, she claimed she viewed the vote as authorizing diplomatic leverage, not necessarily immediate invasion.
But the political reality.
The political reality was that many Democrats in power felt intense pressure post 9/11 to demonstrate strength.
What were the long-term consequences of that vote, especially for her?
It permanently positioned her as a more hawkish Democrat, and it provided immediate political vulnerability. She later fully reversed herself on the vote in 2014 and 2015, calling the decision a mistake.
But that reversal didn't really erase the political damage, did it?
Not at all. That initial vote was a massive liability in both her 2008 and 2016 primary campaigns, especially when she was facing candidates who had opposed the war from the start.
And she spent time on the Armed Services Committee, actively building relationships with high-ranking military officers. This further cemented her positioning as a serious interventionist voice on defense.
Absolutely. This military positioning often complicated her ideological labels. While analyses like those from 538 considered her one of the most liberal senators during her time, her foreign policy stance showed this distinct willingness to use military force, which often put her to the right of more traditional liberals.
Right.
She even opposed the Iraq war troop surge in 2007, initially on political and military grounds, though she later acknowledged privately that the surge did succeed in its immediate goals.
Which brings us to her cabinet role, Secretary of State under President Obama, starting in 2009. A choice that seemed initially improbable given their fierce 2008 primary rivalry.
Her nomination was overwhelmingly confirmed, 94-2. What's fascinating is the political maneuvering. Despite all the acrimony of 2008, she and Obama forged a surprisingly positive and pragmatic working relationship. She proved to be a loyal team player within the administration and was trusted by the president to execute policy globally.
Her core strategy as Secretary of State was this concept of smart power. What exactly did that doctrine entail?
Smart power was her defining foreign policy doctrine for U.S. leadership. It represented a strategic balance. So instead of relying purely on military hard power or purely on soft power like aid or diplomacy, smart power combined them.
How so?
It meant integrating military readiness with diplomacy, global economics, development aid, technology, and, crucially, human rights. She methodically implemented this approach, modeling her departmental reforms, known as the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, or QDDR, on processes she knew from the Senate Armed Services Committee.
The QDDR sounds like a massive undertaking. What was it aiming to achieve?
It was a huge reorganization. The QDDR was essentially a strategic review done every 4 years, designed to align the State Department's diplomatic efforts and USAID's development work with the changing global landscape. It was all about making the use of diplomatic and development tools as strategic, disciplined, and interconnected as the Pentagon's military planning, making diplomacy smarter and faster.
So let's look at some key diplomatic actions during her record-breaking tenure.
She began with a symbolic gesture, presenting Russia with a literal reset button in 2009, attempting to rebuild fractured ties.
A thimble that didn't really hold up in the long run.
No, it didn't. But more consequentially, she helped organize international sanctions against Iran, which were crucial in setting the stage for the multilateral negotiations that eventually led to the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015. She also dedicated significant attention to the strategic pivot to Asia, recognizing the shifting economic and military focus toward the Pacific Rim.
And she took an active, assertive role in the Arab Spring. We see those hawkish tendencies emerge strongly here, particularly regarding the intervention in Libya.
Yes, she was a key internal advocate for the 2011 military intervention in Libya to protect civilians and ultimately to oust Muammar Gaddafi. She aligned herself with key National Security Council figures and overcame internal opposition, including from then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who was very skeptical.
And the decision would become another major point of contention later on.
Absolutely, especially after Libya devolved into greater instability following the intervention.
She also expanded the scope of U.S. foreign policy to explicitly link women's rights and LGBT rights to national security, giving birth to what many called the Hillary Doctrine.
This is a major legacy of her time at state. The Hillary Doctrine viewed women's empowerment and rights as critical for U.S. security interests because she explicitly cited the link between gender inequality and state instability and violence.
And then for LGBT rights.
In a groundbreaking speech before the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in 2011, she championed gay rights abroad, declaring unequivocally, "Gay rights are human rights." This marked a formal, explicit incorporation of LGBT rights into America's official human rights agenda abroad, often in the face of strong international resistance.
She broke another record during this time, too.
She did. Her relentless travel schedule meant she visited 112 countries, making her the most widely traveled Secretary of State ever, surpassing Madeleine Albright's previous record of 96. Her commitment to direct personal diplomacy was a real hallmark of her tenure.
Finally, the Benghazi attack in September 2012, which cast a long shadow over her departure from the State Department and into her next political chapter.
The attack on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi, Libya, sadly resulted in 4 American deaths, including Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens. She accepted responsibility for security lapses in her initial public testimony in January 2013, still accepting formal responsibility for the State Department's security while denying direct involvement in specific security discussions beforehand.
That initial testimony gave us another incredibly memorable, albeit controversial, quote. When she was pressed persistently about the varying initial explanations given by the administration immediately after the attack,
she delivered the famous rejoinder asking, "What difference at this point does it make? It is our job to figure out what happened and do everything we can to prevent it from ever happening again."
And critics just seized on that phrase, "what difference?"
They did, arguing it showed a dismissal of accountability, while her supporters defended it as an expression of frustration that the focus was on political point scoring rather than learning security lessons.
And the investigations just dragged on for years, culminating in that highly publicized 11-hour testimony before the House Select Committee on Benghazi in 2015, right in the middle of her presidential campaign.
She was widely seen as emerging largely unscathed from that lengthy marathon hearing, partly due to her calm demeanor and what many in the media perceived as meandering, repetitive questioning from the Republican majority on the committee. Crucially, the final Republican report, issued in June 2016, ultimately offered no evidence of culpability or misconduct by Clinton herself in the attack or its immediate aftermath. But the process itself further cemented that image of a politician constantly under investigation.
With a resume now featuring First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State, she launched 2 historic campaigns for the presidency. Let's analyze the 2008 attempt first, where she began as the absolute frontrunner.
She certainly did. She faced strong challenges from Barack Obama and John Edwards, but her initial momentum faded pretty quickly. As we noted earlier, the biggest threat to her campaign, the albatross around her political neck, was her past support for the 2002 Iraq War resolution.
That one vote.
That single vote allowed Obama to claim the anti-war mantle, which was crucial to securing the progressive wing of the party.
Despite losing the Iowa caucus, she managed a surprise comeback win in the New Hampshire primary.
That victory was historic. It was the first time a woman won a major American party's presidential primary for delegate selection. Her comeback was often attributed to her being viewed more sympathetically, particularly by women voters, following an emotional moment the day before the election where her eyes welled up while responding to a question about the toll of the campaign.
Right, that moment of vulnerability seemed to connect with voters.
After weeks of being portrayed as too calculating, yes. But the tone of the contest became increasingly acrimonious, and she suffered a major fracture in support after a controversial remark comparing Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon B. Johnson.
This was a real turning point.
It was. She compared King and Johnson, noting that while King had the dream of civil rights, it took a President Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act through Congress. This was widely perceived as minimizing the significance of King's accomplishments and the role of the civil rights movement itself.
And the damage was.
It led to a profound, damaging loss of support among African American voters, which contributed significantly to her inability to win key states and her eventual loss of the nomination to Obama.
Ultimately, she conceded and endorsed Obama in June 2008, having won a significant number of votes.
She had won over 17 million votes, which at the time was a record for a woman candidate in a primary process. So she set a historical marker even in defeat. Her capacity to win that many delegates proved her political viability for the future.
Moving to 2016, she formally announced her second presidential campaign in April 2015, running on a platform focusing on raising middle-class incomes, universal preschool, and improving the Affordable Care Act with a public option.
She was again the prohibitive favorite, but she faced an unexpectedly strong challenge from Democratic socialist Bernie Sanders. The consistent theme leveraged against her was her long connection to Wall Street and her hefty fees for paid speaking engagements after leaving the State Department.
Which contrasted sharply with Sanders' message.
Sharply. It was a perfect foil for his anti-establishment message and call for a political revolution.
What were the policy differences that really defined that primary race with Sanders?
Sanders pushed her significantly to the left on issues like trade and campaign finance. She adopted some of his more progressive stances, like opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP trade deal, despite having supported it as Secretary of State, another example of that political adaptation.
And on healthcare.
While Sanders championed Medicare for all, she focused on reinforcing the existing ACA framework and expanding public options, arguing that Sanders' plans were politically and economically unrealistic.
Despite the stronger-than-expected primary fight, she ultimately secured the nomination.
She did. She was formally nominated at the Democratic National Convention in July 2016, becoming the first woman nominated for president by a major U.S. political party, an undeniable historical moment.
The general election outcome was, as we know, devastating for her supporters and a major political upset.
She was defeated by Donald Trump in the Electoral College, capturing 232 votes to his 306. However, she won the popular vote by more than 2.8 million votes.
2.1% of the total voter base.
Which made her the fifth candidate in U.S. history to win the popular vote but lose the election, highlighting the unique challenges of the U.S. electoral system.
Her campaign became inextricably linked to a single relentless topic, the email controversy. Our sources indicate this received more media coverage than any other topic during the 2016 campaign.
The controversy originated from her decision to conduct official business exclusively through a private email server housed at her home while serving as Secretary of State.
And that immediately raised concerns.
It did. About State Department protocols, record-keeping standards, and most seriously, the security and handling of classified information.
What were the key findings of the FBI investigation led by Director James Comey in July 2016?
Comey delivered a statement that confirmed 110 emails across 52 chains had been determined by the owning agency, not the State Department itself, but agencies like the CIA, to contain classified information at the time they were sent or received.
And some of that was highly classified.
8 of those chains contained information classified at the top secret level.
Though no criminal charges were recommended, Comey's conclusion about her conduct was scathing. He characterized her handling of the material as what?
He noted there was evidence that she and her colleagues were extremely careless in handling sensitive, highly classified information. He specifically noted the dangers of using her personal email extensively while traveling outside the U.S., including in the territory of sophisticated adversaries who could potentially access the system.
The political damage from just the accusation of being extremely careless was immense, even without criminal charges.
The finding essentially validated the narrative that she was secretive and handled sensitive matters with poor judgment, and the controversy didn't end there. The final notification from Comey just 2 weeks before the election is something she and many analysts later cited directly as a factor in her loss.
What was the impact of that late October notification?
Well, Comey notified Congress that the FBI was reviewing newly discovered emails found on a separate computer, effectively reopening the controversy just as voters were finalizing their decisions. Although he notified Congress 2 days before the election that the review was complete, and the initial conclusion, no criminal charges, remained unchanged.
The damage was already done.
The political damage was done. Clinton later explicitly cited that late October notification as significantly contributing to her loss, arguing it changed the momentum of the race in the final days by recentering media attention on process and controversy rather than policy.
This whole episode is a perfect example of how the media focus on process and scandal, as opposed to substantive policy debate, which was largely ignored, can fundamentally shift an election outcome. It's an unfortunate characteristic of modern political journalism.
It really is.
After her 2016 defeat, Clinton confirmed she would not seek public office again. She transitioned back to focusing on philanthropy, academia, and literary work, much as she did after leaving the State Department.
That's right. She remains active in the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, which focuses heavily on global initiatives, particularly early childhood development and global girls' secondary education.
That foundation, however, has also been a continuous target of criticism, especially regarding its fundraising during her political career.
Correct. The controversy centers around the foundation accepting new donations from foreign governments and large donations from foreign citizens during and immediately after her time as Secretary of State. While the foundation has defended the funds as purely philanthropic, critics argued these donations created potential conflicts of interest or the appearance of impropriety, reinforcing that public narrative of questionable judgment or political transactionalism.
She also resumed her lucrative paid speaking career, which had been a sticking point during the 2016 primary against Bernie Sanders.
Post-State Department, she commanded serious fees, earning between $200,000 and $225,000 per paid speaking engagement, often appearing before Wall Street firms, which fueled criticism about her ties to powerful financial interests.
And the total earnings were significant.
The Clintons earned almost $141 million between 2007 and 2014, primarily through speaking engagements and book deals. She published her memoir about her time at State, Hard Choices, in 2014, and the extremely candid memoir about the 2016 campaign, What Happened, in 2017.
Even outside of running for office, she maintains a political presence.
Oh, absolutely. She launched Onward Together in 2017, which is a political action committee dedicated to advancing progressive causes, and she remains an active, often influential voice in Democratic politics, frequently endorsing candidates and weighing in on major policy debates.
What's the latest phase of her career, the one she's occupied since 2020?
It's heavily focused on academia and international cultural diplomacy, returning in a way to the intellectual focus of her early Yale years. Since January 2020, she has served as the 11th Chancellor of Queen's University, Belfast, becoming the first woman in that role, a significant international cultural post.
At Columbia.
Additionally, since January 2023, she has been a professor of practice at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, combining her legal, policy, and diplomatic experience for teaching and mentorship.
She's also dipped her toes into fiction, hasn't she?
She has. She co-authored books with Chelsea Clinton, like The Book of Gutsy Women, and most recently she co-authored a fiction novel, State of Terror, leveraging her deep knowledge of diplomatic and national security crises.
Let's synthesize her political ideology now, which, as we've seen, seems to have shifted significantly over time, from a Goldwater conservative to a center-left Democrat.
She self-identifies as a new Democrat or centrist liberal. In 2016, trying to define her place in a polarized party, she stated, "I plead guilty to being moderate and center."
But those labels are tricky.
Very. If you measure her policy positions scientifically, analyses like those from 538 placed her among the most liberal members during her Senate years, demonstrating how the term center changes depending on the political environment.
What defines her economic philosophy now?
Her economic plan, often called inclusive capitalism, aims to bridge progressive goals with market stability. Key proposals include increasing collective bargaining rights, offering major incentives for companies that share profits with employees, and proposing a clawback mechanism rescinding tax relief for companies that move jobs overseas.
And domestically.
Domestically, she strongly supports universal preschool and tax increases on the wealthy to fund programs like improving the Affordable Care Act through a public option.
And on foreign policy, she has long been characterized by her interventionist or hawkish tendencies, sometimes even to the right of Republican opponents.
That is consistent throughout her career. Her foreign policy stance is often described as interventionist. She supported the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, the 2011 Libya intervention, and later she favored more aggressive action against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, including taking out his airfields to prevent the bombing of innocent civilians. She has always been a strong proponent of maintaining robust U.S. influence in the Middle East and providing unwavering support for Israel's right to defense.
Finally, that massive ideological shift regarding LGBT rights, a perfect illustration of the pragmatist catching up to the idealist.
A profound shift that mirrors the national political evolution, but which was, delayed compared to many in her party. In 2000, during her Senate campaign, she explicitly opposed same-sex marriage. By 2006, she had shifted to supporting states' rights to permit it, but still opposed a federal amendment. It wasn't until 2013, after leaving the State Department, that she explicitly supported a national right to same-sex marriage.
The long transition.
It reflects the political difficulty of adapting a moderate establishment position to rapidly changing cultural and legal norms.
All of this history, the multiple roles, the ideological shifts, the scandals, it all feeds into a public image that is perpetually fraught.
She has consistently been described as a highly polarizing figure, perhaps best labeled a Rorschach test for the evolution of women in society. People tend to project their own hopes or fears regarding female power onto her.
But there were periods where her image improved dramatically.
Yes. Her image dramatically improved while she was Secretary of State, transforming her into that respected world figure, a trend marked by her tremendous travel record. That high favorability, however, dropped sharply once she re-entered partisan politics in the 2016 campaign. Yet, her historical significance as a barrier breaker is undeniable, reflected in Time magazine choosing her for its 2016 Woman of the Year cover in 2019, acknowledging the historical weight of her nomination.
To look back at the scope of this deep dive, from her conservative roots in Park Ridge, through her academic success at Yale, the crucial years in Arkansas politics and law, becoming an unprecedented First Lady, navigating 8 years in the Senate, then serving as a record-breaking global diplomat, and finally becoming the first female major party nominee for president. I mean, few American figures have embodied so many high-level roles and faced such sustained, intense public scrutiny and political opposition.
What stands out to me looking at the entire arc is that relentless ability to transition and adapt, that continuous negotiation between the Rodham idealist and the Clinton pragmatist. She moved from a major policy failure as First Lady to successful legislative action on SEI. She shifted from a senator who cast the ill-fated Iraq War vote to a Secretary of State who became a trusted, pragmatic partner to the president she once ran against. She mastered electoral politics in New York and diplomatic relationships worldwide, all while navigating waves of deeply personal and political controversies.
Her capacity to operate successfully,
Often setting new precedents for women in the process, is utterly undeniable, regardless of one's political viewpoint. She learned to operate within the system she inherited, making strategic compromises along the way.
it's a career built on persistence and an unwavering belief in achieving change from within the halls of power, rather than tearing them down.
And that persistence raises an important question for you, the learner, to consider as you reflect on her history. We've seen her career defined by seeking change from within the existing establishment, dating all the way back to her earliest college years at Wellesley. Considering the numerous major shifts in her political positions over time on issues like the Iraq War, same-sex marriage, and economic policy, does her long tenure in the political establishment suggest that fundamental, lasting change in American policy is more successfully achieved through persistent, incremental influence over decades, even with necessary political compromises, rather than through attempts at radical rupture or total outsider campaigns? Something to chew on as you watch the next political generation rise.